Hello, and welcome to Obscure Fare, the podcast dedicated to the study of humanity's lesser-known attempts to kill each other. This episode is a direct continuation of my mini-series on the Anglo-Zulu War, so if you haven't watched the first episode on the Battle of Hlobane, I highly recommend it. It'll provide some context to this situation, as well as details about the characters this episode will focus on and the forces under their command. But without further ado, I'll rejoin our narrative on the morning of the 29th of March, 1879. The disaster at Hlobane did have one major positive consequence. It provoked the main Zulu army, or Impi, and drew it into an assault on the fortified British encampment atop the mountain of Khambula, which our heroes from last episode, Buller and Wood, had constructed on the 30th of January. Wood and his men, the number 4 column, would have the upper hand at Khambula for a multitude of reasons, foremost of which is the defensibility of Khambula camp itself, which I'll come on to in a minute. The terrain was also much more favourable to the British. The environs around the mountain of Khambula were mostly flat, open veldt, with little cover. The Zulus would be forced to attack a veritable fortress with very little protection for their own skirmishers. The advised way to entrench a camp was set out in the Field Guide for operations in South Africa. Commanders were to surround their encampment with what was called a laager, a cluster of tents surrounded by wagons. The wagons would be linked together and thus provide cover for those in the camp, and the fortification could be disassembled for moving with relative ease. Most historians blame the disaster at Isandlwana, at least in part, on Chelmsford's failure to laager his own camp. Wood had ensured, however, that the Khambula camp was a veritable castle. The central position was an earthwork fort in which Wood had positioned 2 of his 6 cannon. This fort had thick earthen walls that provided significant cover to its occupants and sat atop a narrow ridge, giving it an excellent field of fire over the open country below. Just to the right of this fortification was Wood's main laager, in which most of his men were positioned. To say this laager was strong is a monumental understatement. The wagons themselves were each 20 feet long and 6 feet wide, with iron-rimmed wheels as tall as a man. They were so heavy that they required 16 oxen to pull, oxen being far from a feeble animal. A circle of these wagons would have been formidable in and of itself, but Wood went further. The wheels were chained to one another with iron chains as thick as an arm, and each wagon had its tow bar, for want of a better word, chained to the chassis of the one in front, ensuring that no one point of the hexagonal structure could be tipped or moved. The gaps between and beneath each wagon had been filled with earth, so the structure was a single, unbroken wall, surrounded by a second wall of sandbags, about as tall as a man, with nooks called embrasures built in to allow the defenders a hole through which to pour volleys out at the enemy. Lastly, the right flank of this fortification sat on the edge of a ravine, making this edge almost completely unassailable. The slope to the left of the camp, which was also commanded by the fort, remember, was far more approachable, but afforded no cover to any approaching force, allowing Wood's other 4 cannon, which were sited in a battery in the open ground between the fort and the main laager, a completely clear field of fire. Almost directly below this fort, and diagonally to the left of the main laager, was a second, smaller laager, in which Wood had kept his 2,000 cattle. This position was not very defensible, and as such was fairly lightly garrisoned, although its right flank was likewise anchored by the aforementioned ravine. Before leaving for the doomed assault on Hlobane, Wood had ordered a palisade built between the cattle laager and the fort, which would close the gap in the fortifications and present the Zulus with a triangle of thick walls and bristling with guns. His subordinates had quibbled with this command, arguing that the weight of numbers behind the Zulus would just topple the palisade, but Wood replied that the delay caused by this toppling would, quote, allow the rifles another several minutes, during which they can make a second barricade of human bodies, end quote. So now we know all about the formidable fortress that was Khambula Camp, we should look at those who defended it. Despite the comprehensive losses at Hlobane and the desertions during the night of the entire Boer contingent and the majority of the Swazis, Wood still had a garrison of 2,086 officers and men under his command. The regular infantry would provide the column with most of its hitting power, and this consisted of 2 infantry battalions, the 90th Light Infantry, comprising 527 men, and the 1st Battalion of the 13th Light Infantry Regiment, with 711 men. These men were supported by the carbines of 659 cavalrymen, only some of whom were mounted, and who were now under the sole command of our good friend, Lieutenant Colonel Redvers Buller. Wood refused to wait for Chelmsford's confirmation, and relieved Russell of command immediately after the Hlobane fiasco. 58 of Wood's Swazis had remained, including all of their white officers, and all of them were issued with firearms. Lastly, the 110 artillerymen from the 11th 7th Battery Royal Artillery and their 6 guns accompanied 11 Royal Engineers, completing Wood's garrison. Finally, we can rejoin the narrative proper. The morning of the 29th of March, 1879, was very misty, such that the visibility around the British camp was reduced to about 100 yards. To compensate for this relative blindness, Wood sent Commandant Raaf out with an escort of 20 Transvaal Rangers, an irregular cavalry corps from one of the British states that bordered Zululand, to Hlobane, in order to check up on the Zulus. When he returned, at about 10 a.m, the mist had lifted, but Raaf had useful information nonetheless. The Zulus were not yet marching, but cooking breakfast in their camp atop the mountain. Reassured by this information, Wood sent out 2 companies to gather firewood, so that his men could cook breakfast of their own, and engaged in some last-minute preparation, opening reserve ammunition boxes and placing them strategically behind the firing lines. He had drilled his men so comprehensively and well that they could strike their tents and be at their posts in 70 seconds. Unlike Chelmsford, Wood would not be taken by surprise. At 11 o'clock, the scouts placed a few miles from the camp reported that the Zulu army was on the move, and thus the oxen were driven into their laager and the wood-cutting parties recalled. Before long, the 20,000 warriors of Ketshwayo's main impi were in sight, travelling in 5 huge columns towards the tiny British garrison. They halted about 4 miles away to make last-minute preparations of their own, their war doctors performing the sacred battle rituals that were supposed to protect the Zulus from the bullets of their invaders. They assumed their usual formation, the horns of the buffalo, whereby a body of Zulus, the chest, would engage the enemy, whilst 2 large flanking forces, the horns, encircled and annihilated the trapped forces of whomever was unlucky enough to assault it. By midday, the impi were approaching close, and the battle was about to begin in earnest. Ketshwayo, the Zulu king, was, to his credit, a very clever man. He had warned his troops and commanders from the very start that they should not attack the British in fortified positions, because the British would have the upper hand. The battle-hungry, Sontaran-esque Zulus, however, especially the younger Amabutho and their leaders, were reluctant to obey this order, and frequently attacked the invaders in their entrenched camps. In fairness to them, of the 3 clear Zulu victories in the Zulu War, 2 were assaults on a fortified position. The difference is that Wood was an expert and careful commander who took due care and fortified his camp properly. This fact was lost on the Zulus, and their earlier successes had imbued them with a confidence that would propel them towards the death trap of Khambula with vigour. The commander of the Zulu forces at Khambula, Chief Munyamana, however, was not so rash, and stated after the fact that he had never intended to assault the position properly, but that his men, when presented with what they thought to be the perfect target, had disobeyed him and attacked anyway, forcing Munyamana's hand. Whatever the intention of the Zulus, the fact of the matter is that they attacked the camp at Khambula with purpose. But it is worth remembering that Ketshwayo was wiser than his rash subordinates. One man, in particular, deserves extra credit for goading the younger Zulu regiments into attacking, as Munyamana said, and that man was Lieutenant Colonel Buller. He led 100 men of the Imperial Mounted Infantry, the largest and freshest corps of cavalry, out of the laager and around the flank of the Zulu right horn. There they let loose a few volleys, causing the inexperienced flanking force to turn and charge at the horsemen against the orders of their officers. This was an incredibly brave move by Buller, and he sums it up well. Quote, "Their right column, about 2,000 strong, turned and charged us. I need not tell you that the 80 or 90 men I had got on their horses pretty quick, and we scampered back to camp, holding a running fight with them as we went." End quote. Amusingly, the pursuit was a very close one for one man in particular, Cecil Russell, the moron of Hlobane. Who had been killed had Lieutenant Brown, the man Russell had left to die atop the mountain, not gone back and helped him mount his horse, which had bolted at the sight of the Zulus, who were by now a mere 30 yards away. He escaped, nonetheless, and only one horseman was killed. Brown was awarded a Victoria Cross for saving the life of a man who, let's not forget, clearly had no concern for his, and who had taken his job. The right horn, however, had been drawn into a charge, and they were loath to stop it. Led by the Ingobamakosi regiment, which I'm almost certainly mispronouncing, they barreled right up to the main laager, getting within 300 yards before the cannon and Martini Henry rifles of Wood's force unleashed a maelstrom of bullets and shrapnel on the Zulu force. The cannon were in their element here. They were fairly small guns, at only 7 pounds, this relating to the weight of shot they fired, not the weight of the gun itself, but they were deadly. As well as a traditional cannonball, the cannon could be charged with canister, basically a tin can full of hundreds of bullets, stones and metal shards that burst open when fired and scattered in a large cone in front of the gun, rather like an enormous shotgun. Additionally, they could fire shrapnel shells that exploded amongst the massed Zulus, sending more wickedly sharp shards of metal that would eviscerate anyone in the immediate vicinity that weathered the explosion. This withering fire was too much for the Ingobamakosi, who had already lost their regimental commander to a rifle bullet, and the regiment routed, throwing themselves to the ground to escape the British guns. The fatal charge of the right horn had spurred their comrades in the rest of the army into a similar action, though, largely down to the fierce competition between the different Amabutho, or regiments. Unable to sit idly whilst the Ingobamakosi took the glory, the left horn, led by the Umakijo regiment, charged the other side of the main laager, to their comrades on the right. Simultaneously, the chest of the force, where most of the experienced, older Amabutho were concentrated, committed themselves against the small garrison in the cattle kraal. Buller had goaded the Ingobamakosi into action at 1:45, and by 2:20 the charge of the main army was hitting home. The chest's assault met a similar response to the first. They were stopped in their tracks by the lethal volleys of the British riflemen and the canister of the artillery. The left horn had a touch more success, using the cover of the ravine to get within 100 yards of the laager, but at close range the fire of the Martini Henrys only increased in potency, and after a while the Umakijo was similarly routed. At this point, the Zulus changed their tactics, sending a squadron of roughly 40 marksmen with captured rifles into the camp's rubbish heaps, which were a few hundred yards behind the cattle laager. This was one of the few chinks in Wood's armour. The rubbish heaps and the huts that surrounded them provided cover from which the Zulu snipers could assault the least defensible of the three positions. The cattle laager was, for one, full of cows, which made coordinating a defence rather difficult. It was also far less sturdy or comprehensively fortified as the main laager, and held only by one company of the 13th. This company began to lose men at such a rate that Wood set out to recall them to the redoubt, and a good example of the colonel's personal courage can be found here. As he reached the laager, one of the men defending it was hit in the leg and fell in an exposed position. Wood instinctively ran out of cover to help the injured man, but was held back by Captain Maud, one of his replacement staff officers, who told him, quote, "It really isn't your place to pick up single men." End quote. Lieutenants Lysons and Smith, Wood's other two staff officers, went in his stead and dragged the man to safety, although Smith sustained a bullet wound to the arm in the process. Shortly after this incident, a concerted effort by the Unokhenke regiment forced the British out of the cattle enclosure, and it was occupied by marksmen with captured Martini Henrys. You'll remember a few minutes ago we learned that 4 of Wood's 6 guns were positioned in a battery between the main laager and the fort. Well, from this point, the fighting began to get rather hot for the artillerymen. Their position was directly in front of the cattle laager, and their rear was completely unguarded. This was a problem, as when the laager fell to the Unok Henke, their snipers took up the stations that had been occupied by Wood's men, and began to make life very difficult for the gunners, under Lieutenant Frederick Slade. He recalled, quote, "I was now left alone in the open, and the enemy with Martini Henry rifles made it very hot for me, and I never expected to leave that battery alive. In less time than it takes me to write this, my second in command was shot right through the body, and my dear old horse Saracen was shot. But my men stood at their guns like bricks. We fired round after round of canister into them, hitting oxen and Zulu alike, and a merry hail of bullets were pouring into us. Captain Gardner was shot through the thigh, and I shot the Zulu who had wounded him with my revolver, so you can imagine how close they were." End quote. So to recap, the battle had started in earnest at about midday, with multiple Zulu charges repulsed. By 3:30, Zulu marksmen had driven Wood's men from, and subsequently occupied, the cattle laager, and were taking aim at the guns between the remaining 2 British positions. Buller and the cavalry have retired for the minute to the safety of the main laager, and the remaining Zulus are, for the moment, pinned down by volley fire and unable to oust the rest of Wood's forces from their fortifications. The battle was, at this point, reaching its height, and Wood noticed a large number of warriors from the Mbonambi regiment congregating in the ravine, which anchored the right flank of the main laager. Their regimental commanders, or indunas, were rallying them and trying to encourage them to charge the artillery. Ever the bold commander, Wood decided on a preemptive strike to crush the assault before it even left the ravine. He ordered 2 companies of the 90th to fix bayonets, leave the main laager, and turn the Zulus out of their cover, whilst he again took a very hands-on approach, borrowing a carbine from a cavalryman and killing the lead induna. 2 more chiefs took his place at the head of their men, and both were shot down by Wood before the redcoats got to them. When this occurred, the leaderless warriors were scattered fairly quickly, and the 2 companies advanced after them until they came out of cover and under heavy fire from the marksmen in the rubbish heaps and the cattle laager. After losing 2 officers, one of whom was blinded in both eyes, and about 25 men, Wood ordered his men to retire and return to the safety of the camp. As this was going on, Buller likewise led a company of the 13th in a bayonet charge that repulsed an assault by the surviving Umakijo, the regiment that had led the left horn. The charges had seriously demoralised the remaining Zulus, who had seen their best regiments routed and chased off, first by volley fire and then at the point of the British bayonet. The pressure on the camp's defenders began to slacken as the vigour of the remaining regiments, mostly those in the chest, died away. Seeing this as an opportunity, Lieutenant Slade, the commander of the artillery, proposed an ambitious plan to retake the cattle laager. At about 4 o'clock, he turned his guns around and opened fire on the marksmen that had occupied it, before charging in, quote, "sword in hand and at the double," end quote. He and 2 companies of the 13th that had accompanied him were repulsed, but the Zulus in the laager had suffered badly. Fearing further attacks, Wood rushed over to Buller's position at the other side of the main laager to check on him, and Buller was apparently cheery and confident. It seems that Wood was underestimating the impact that the bayonets had had on his enemy. By this point, the fighting spirit of the Zulus was broken, and the subsequent charges were lacklustre and uncoordinated. At 4:30, the Ingobamakosi attempted to press home their earlier failed charge, but were, like the rest, beaten back with heavy casualties. Finally, at about 5:15, Wood gave Slade permission to assault the cattle laager once again, and this time he and the 2 companies of the 13th were successful. Wood, meanwhile, personally led a 3rd company of the 13th in a bayonet charge against the relatively unscathed Undi regiment, which had formed part of the chest. Pinning them to the ravine, he and his men, quote, "did great execution of them with the bayonets," end quote. With this, the Impi gave up the ghost and broke, with the majority of the Amabutho fleeing. The Zulus amongst the rubbish pits were quickly dispersed when the defenders of the main laager and those in the newly recaptured cattle enclosure fired volleys in amongst them. As anyone who has ever played a total war game will know, it is in pursuit of a routed foe that cavalry really makes its mark, and Wood was well aware of this. He set Buller and his mounted irregulars on the fleeing warriors, and Buller remembers it well. Quote, "We were up and at them. Had it not been dark, their losses would have been very heavy. Still, I cannot think that the number we killed and wounded in the pursuit was less than 300, at least." End quote. One of the corps under Buller's control was the Frontier Light Horse, under the command of Captain Cecil de Arcy. They had suffered badly at Hlobane. As the rear guard, they were the last people to make it off the mountain, and were skirmishing constantly throughout the battle. This had given them a hunger for revenge, and Darcy recalled, quote, "We followed them for 8 miles, butchering the brutes all over the place. I told the men, 'No quarter, boys, and remember yesterday.' On the line where we followed them were 157 bodies counted the next day." End quote. Chelmsford's assessment was that the pursuit would have been far more effective, quote, "had the horsemen not been unable from physical fatigue to make as much of the pursuit as they might otherwise have done." End quote. The cavalry drove the retreating impi all the way back to Hlobane, where the onset of a fog forced the British to retire. British losses at Khambula were, in no small part thanks to the expert fortifications, very light. 18 men were killed, no officers. 57 men and 8 officers were wounded, and 3 of those officers, as well as 7 of the men, later died of their wounds. The amount of Zulus killed is a topic of much debate. 785 bodies were found in the vicinity of the camp itself, and these were buried in a mass grave with full military honours. The amount of Zulus killed in the pursuit, or who died of their wounds, is unknown. Estimates range from Buller's very conservative 300 to Francis Colenso's estimate of over 1,500. Most historians seem to agree that a sensible guess is 2,000 Zulus killed in the entire engagement, including the 700 confirmed. Amongst the confirmed dead were a great many in Duna, many of whom had been making themselves visible in an attempt to rally their men. The British also recovered a great many assegais from the battle, as well as some 400 firearms, of which 14 were Martini Henrys, and the rest were obsolete muskets and older rifles. Wood was vociferous in his praise for Khambula's defenders, mentioning that his men had fired an average of 33 rounds per man across 4 hours, showing their steady and careful firing. He wrote afterwards, quote, "I heard that some of them had thought the possibility of resisting such overwhelming numbers of brave savages, 13 or 14 to every man, was more than doubtful. I had no doubt, though, and lost all sense of personal danger, except momentarily when, as on 5 occasions, the plank upon which I leant was struck by a bullet." End quote. Munyamana was not so lucky, and, despite his best efforts, the majority of his troops simply vanished after Khambula, likely returning to their homes. Only a token force accompanied him back to Quechua to face the music. The king was incensed at men and commander both, who had ignored his orders and attacked a fortified position. Exactly what he feared had come true. Quechua knew, at this point, that defeating the invaders in the field was impossible. He had lost too many men over the course of the war, and what men he still had were broken and demoralised. Never again would a Zulu impi charge an enemy with as much bravery and vigour as had been displayed at Isandlwana and Khambula, and not for the rest of the war would the British allow themselves to be caught in the open without either fortifications or overwhelming firepower. Thanks to the skill and diligence of Colonel Evelyn Wood and the dash and ruthlessness of Lieutenant Colonel Redvers Buller, it was not a matter of whether the British would conquer Zululand, but when. So that's all for this episode, and indeed for our mini-series on the Anglo-Zulu War. I do hope you've enjoyed it. I've given some thought to it, and I think that the next couple of episodes will be on the Indian Mutiny of 1857, and then after that we'll move very far afield and cover the Mithridatic Wars between Rome and the Kingdom of Pontus in the 1st century AD. So I do hope you enjoy those, and you should follow the show to make sure you don't miss them. Before I wrap up for today, I just want to cover some housekeeping matters. Firstly, there will be a Google form in the description of this episode on which you can submit any feedback, comments, requests or corrections, and I'd really appreciate it if you take the time to fill it out. It'll help me tailor future episodes and improve the show. Secondly, there is a Patreon you can use to support the show, and it has a bunch of very respectable perks for those who choose to do so. Not least a series of bonus episodes on conflicts too short to warrant their own episodes. Patrons of all ranks will get a shout out at the end of episodes, so if you want to join the Obscure Fare rank and file and win my undying gratitude, go to patreon.com/obscurefare. With the shameless self-promotion out of the way, I'll say thank you for listening. I hope you tune in next week for our foray into India, and I hope you have a great day.